I shouldn't be your pastor. In fact, I don't even think I should be a pastor at all. And some of you know the process that goes into preparing someone for pastoral ministry in order to make sure that they're qualified to serve. It goes all the way back to your undergraduate program, where before you can go on to the seminary, you have to sit down with the district office and you have to go through an interview process. And they take character witnesses, and then they bring a recommendation to the district president to say, okay, this person can now go to seminary, but you're not done yet. You take all of these required classes, and there are even specific requirements where you have to sit down with a counselor who will psychoanalyze you throughout your time at the seminary. And then you have to go into your pastoral internship, and you have to pass that. And even after you have met all of those requirements, even when the seminary says that you can graduate from their institution, before you can receive a call, you have to go through a background check and make sure that there's nothing in your past that would prevent you from being a pastor. And yet, even after that entire process, I don't think that I should be a pastor. I don't think that I should be your pastor. Because there's something that happened in my life when I was 17 years old, which is 25 years ago now. Something that happened to me when I was 17 that could have dramatically changed the trajectory of my entire life. So I was a 17-year-old kid, and I had just gotten done working my shift at the local gas station down in Nicollet, about 45 minutes south and west of here. And it was late in the evening, and some of my friends were hanging around after, and I got in my car, and one of my friends, was dumb, shouldn't have done it, he got on the hood of my car. And if you've ever heard the term car surfing, it is what it sounds like. And it's dumb, I don't recommend it. But you stand on the hood of someone's car and they drive you around and you surf. And I was a 17-year-old who was behind the wheel that night, and my friend was the one who was surfing, and I took off too fast. And as I headed out to the highway, I could see it in slow motion as my friend slid down the hood of my car and off to the right, and I ran him over. And in that moment, I thought I'd killed him. I could hear the thump of his head hitting the ground. I thought it was over. And I stopped the car, and I turned around and I looked back. And to make a long story short, I didn't kill him. Otherwise, I truly don't think I would be here today. But he was severely injured. He had to go to the hospital. Thankfully, I had friends who were able to stay with me. They were able to drive me home. But then I had to tell my parents. And I had to wake up the next morning and go to school. And everybody there in small town Minnesota, you get it, you understand it. They knew what had happened. And then there was the investigation. There was the insurance company, there were the police that showed up at school and sat down with me. And thankfully, no charges were pressed. And my friend actually made a full recovery. And I look back on that moment from 25 years ago, and I think, it's only by the grace of God that I am where I am right now. In fact, that's what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 10. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And it's that verse that I want to unpack with you this afternoon as we continue our Lenten series, Grace Stories. Because I believe that Paul is a living, breathing testimony of God's grace. And you and I are called to be the same. You see, if you want to dig into Paul's past, there's a lot of dirt there that you could hold against him that should disqualify him from being an apostle, from being a pastor in the church. In fact, if Paul were to consider ministry today, I don't think he would make it. I think he'd get to the seminary admission interview and they'd say, sorry, Paul, there's too much that is stacked against you in the past. You can't serve as a pastor. And Paul even knew that. So you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 9, and it says, for I am the least of the apostles, And I do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I was a persecutor of the church," is a familiar story for many of you. Words that are recorded in more detail in Acts chapter 9, which we read earlier this afternoon. Words that begin in this way. Saul, also known as Paul, was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's people, against the church. And I hear those words, and immediately my mind thinks terrorist. Because that's what a terrorist does. They breathe out murderous threats. They believe that they are utterly convinced, they're blinded to believe that the world would be a better place without a certain group of people. And that was Saul. That was Paul. He believed that the world would be a better place without people who believed in Jesus, because Paul believed that Jesus was a fraud. Paul believed that Jesus was a fake. He believed that he was a false prophet. And he believed that he was dead. Paul didn't believe in Jesus. Until one day where he is breathing out these murderous threats against the Lord's people, and he's traveling to Damascus, and there he's blinded by a light, and he comes face to face with Jesus, the risen, reigning Christ, the one that he thought was a fake, the one that he thought was dead. And now it's this oh crud moment. And I love where the story goes from here, because Saul is blinded and he's led by the hand into Damascus, and there he sits in this house for 3 days and he fasts and he prays. And then God sends a man to him by the name of Ananias. And this is where we see God's grace, because the word Ananias means the Lord is full of grace. And so here is Saul, and he's sitting there, and he's blinded, because this is the way that he's lived his life. He's been blinded to the ways of God, and now God shows up in a man named Ananias in order to announce the grace of God to him. And Saul's eyes are opened. He receives the Holy Spirit. He puts his trust in Jesus. He's baptized. And his life trajectory is completely changed. And now, years later, as he's a prominent pastor in the church, he looks back on that moment in his past and says, "But by the grace of God, I am what I am." And you and I can echo that in our lives. Because like Paul, we've all had moments where we've been blinded to what the truth is. Like Paul, we've all had those moments where we have been going against the will that God had for us in our lives. And when we found ourselves in places like that, what does God do? God puts people like Ananias in our lives to remind us that God is full of grace. That night 25 years ago, that person for me was my best friend named Quinn. And more than he even knows it, I owe my life to him that night. Because in the moments that followed after I'd run over this friend of mine, I didn't want to go forward. I didn't want to face the consequences of my choices. And yet Quinn did not leave me alone for a moment. He sat there with me. He drove me home. He prayed for me. And he reminded me that God was not done with me. He reminded me that God was full of grace. And because of him, I'm still here today. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And Paul loves telling the story. He loves telling his testimony. Like, you can look through the pages of the New Testament, and you can see on 4 different occasions, like, he's not trying to shove this in his past. Like, he's putting it out there for everybody to see. In Acts chapter 22, he tells this story. In Galatians chapter 1, he tells this story. In 1 Corinthians 15, where we are today, he tells the story. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, he tells the story, and he's like, Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. And here's what I love about Paul's grace story, is it's not about merely grace in the past. It's not merely, I want you to look back at this one moment in my life where desperately I needed God's grace. It's no, but by the grace of God, I am, present tense, I am what I am. It's not only amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved, past tense, a wretch like me. No, it's His grace has brought me safe thus far. His grace will see me home, as we sing in the words of Amazing Grace. It's not only past tense, it's present tense. It's ongoing. And that's important for us to remember as we look at all the different contours of the word grace as it appears in Scripture, especially, most prominently in Paul's letters, is that it's not only saving grace, it's sustaining grace. Which means it's not only grace that happens then, it's grace that happens again and again and again in our lives. And if I'm honest with you, not only did I need God's grace 25 years ago that night, but I need it over and over and over again in my life. Every single day, I need God's grace. I need God to rescue me from myself, from my destructive, selfish choices. I need God to rescue me from the vices that threaten to destroy my life. I need God to deliver me from every destructive temptation. I need God to expose every demonic deception that rises within me. And to help me to overcome every ounce of doubt that pops up within me. And what I've seen again and again and again is that He has. And that He will. Because not only has His grace saved me, I've seen that His grace continues to sustain me. And think about this in some of the conversations that I have with parishioners. Because one of the commitments that I have made as a pastor, and I make this commitment to you today, is that there's nothing that you can tell me in confidence that on some level I don't understand, or that I haven't experienced on some level when I look deep into the recesses of my own sinful heart. There's absolutely nothing that you can tell me that I don't on some level understand, or that I on some level haven't experienced. In fact, there are times when I'm sitting there having a conversation with someone, I'm like, are you reading my mail right now? Because you're in the same place that I am, or you're in the same place where I have been. And yet I want them to know, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. And God's grace has seen me through, and God's grace can see them through as well. And then there are other times where I'm listening to the conversation, and I find myself flashing back to places where I've been in my life, and I'm thinking, unless God stopped me then and there, I'd be in the same place and in the same predicament as you are. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. Whether it's God graciously bringing me back or God graciously preventing me from destroying my own life. It's all by God's grace. We're saved by grace, and we're sustained by grace. But then there's one more element, there's one more dimension to grace as Paul unpacks it in his letters. And it almost seems wrong to say this as a Lutheran. Because as Lutherans, we tend to think like works are over here, and grace is over here. But there are actually some times where grace works, where grace does something. And so I refer to this type of grace as striving grace. By the way, I don't think this is going to show up in a theological textbook out there anywhere, but it's still biblically present. In fact, it's present within our text for today. Because Paul continues, but by the grace of God I am what I am, and His grace was not without effect in me. No, I worked harder than all of them. And by the way, right here, it almost seems like Paul is doing a little bit of bragging. Like all the other apostles, I've worked harder than all of them. But notice what he then says. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. He gives credit where credit is due. So we can look at the contours of grace, and we can say on the one hand that God's grace is for us. It's past tense. This is what Jesus has done through His suffering and death on the cross. It is for us. It's a grace that is for us. It's a saving grace. But then there's also a grace that is at work in us. It's present tense. It's sustaining us. It's keeping us in the Christian faith. But then there's also, as Paul lays out here, there's also a striving grace. There is a grace that is at work through us. It's future focused. It's what God is laying out, the work that he has prepared for us to do as he works that out in and through our lives. And you can see that in the story of Paul when you look at Acts chapter 9. That even as he is saved by God's grace, God is also pointing his story forward. He's like, Paul, I got a plan for you. And you look at Acts chapter 9, verse 15, and God lays out that plan. He says that you are going to speak my name before Gentiles and before their kings and their rulers. And you look at everything that Paul then goes on to accomplish with his life. It's like, Paul, you're the GOAT. If you haven't heard that term before, GOAT stands for the greatest of all time. So, my 5th grade son right now is tasked with writing a persuasive essay on who is the GOAT in a particular category. Well, if you look at apostle, and you say, who's the greatest of all time? I know Paul's not going to take credit for it. He's going to, in fact, say that he is the least of all apostles. He doesn't even deserve to be called an apostle. But let's look at Paul today. We have churches that are named St. Paul. We give kids, like my parents gave to me, the middle name, Paul. And you look at what Paul went to do with his life from that point forward. He crisscrossed the world, traveled over 10,000 miles, 3 different missionary journeys, 14 different churches that he planted, 13 letters that he wrote that are included in the New Testament. That's half of our New Testament. And it came from Paul. And yet Paul doesn't take credit for that. Because it's the grace of God that is at work in him. And I would end by saying the same is true for you and for me. None of us deserve to be where we are. None of us truly are qualified for the task that we have accomplished in life. And yet God is at work in all of us. I mean, just think about some of the things that you have been enabled to accomplish in your life. And some of you, it's more, and maybe some of you are like, it's not that much, and yet it's still something. And what matters isn't necessarily the quantity of what you've accomplished. It's just looking at what you've accomplished and realizing that God is the one that through his grace has enabled you to accomplish what you have. And so it's the grace of God that has allowed you to work the job that you have had. Some of you for many, many years. It's the grace of God that has allowed you to retire from that job that you've had and to live comfortably. It's the grace of God that allows you to get back up again and again after you face failure in your life. It's the grace of God that gives you the health that you have. And even when that health is taken from you, even when you face setbacks and sicknesses and surgeries, it's the grace of God that enables you to regain your strength. It's the grace of God that not only allows you to work the job that you have, but even when you're exhausted from that job, it's the grace of God that allows you to go home and love your wife well. It's the grace of God that allows you to raise your children in the discipline and the admonition of the Lord. It's the grace of God that gives you the wisdom that you need to impart it to others who need it the most. It's the grace of God that allows you the courage to speak up for others who are underrepresented. It's the grace of God that allows you to care for those who are sick and hurting. It's all grace. It's a grace that saves. It's a grace that sustains. And it's a grace that strives until the end. But by the grace of God, I stand here and say, I am what I am. But by the grace of God, you are what you are. And yet, His grace was not without effect.